Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Like we say on this show, it all depends the time zone from where you are watching us from. Welcome to The Leader on Hope TV and the various social platforms, including Legacy Media, where you may be watching us from. Today, we're going to talk about empowering pastors for leadership. I thought that pastors naturally were already leaders, but to help me just unpack that, I'm very glad to have with me in studio Ruben van Riesbeck, but he said just call me Ruben. Karibu sana, like we say here.
Thank you so much and welcome.
All right, let's just get to start from the beginning because I'm curious. You just told me you almost owned a forest, so I'm very curious to know who is this man? Yeah.
Well,
Your background, where you're from, how you grew up, how you missed out on being co-owner of a forest to where you are today.
Well, I was born in South Africa. I've lived there my whole life, but my ancestors come from the Netherlands many years ago. That's why the name is Van Rensburg. I started out as a school teacher, teaching religious instruction and Latin. Taught Latin for 8 years, and slowly but surely, I don't know why, God moved me up the ladder. Eventually became a school inspector and then the policy developer for religious education at the National Department of Education. I was part of a commission that looked at the future of religious education in the schools. And then God led me to become the principal of the South African Theological Seminary. Most people just know it as SATS. And I served there for 18 years. Until 2018 when I retired, and then I was asked to run a project called Reformer. And Reformer is a project designed to bring a global standard to non-formal ministry training, to help pastors who are untrained or undertrained.
Wow. What a CV in less than 2 minutes. But the part that stuck out for me, you taught Latin. I mean, the only Latin guys I know were people in the Bible, and other guys were really strong, going around clubbing everybody. Or Asterix, actually.
Well, in the early days, South Africa still had a requirement that doctors and lawyers had to have at least 1 year of Latin, because many of the medical terms and the legal terms were in Latin. But that's no longer a requirement. So Latin is kind of gone.
Wow. Okay. I understand. I almost thought you were going to start speaking Latin to me and I'd get lost. So, at Reformer, why Reformer? What difference is it making?
So in 2016, there was a conference in Thailand, and at that conference, research was announced from a global survey that had been conducted by Gordon Conwell University. And that survey revealed that only 5% of all the pastors in the world, in all denominations, have a formal qualification, meaning a bachelor's or a master's degree. All the rest fall into the non-formal or the informal sector. And that's hard for some people in the West to understand, because when they go to church on a Sunday morning, they expect a sermon from somebody who's qualified. But the reality is that that's not the case in most of the countries of the world. Pastors in many places have no training or very little training. And so at the end of that year, Dr. Manfred Cole, who was the Overseas Council ambassador, got together a team of experts from around the world to try to find a solution to what is a massive crisis, because many of those pastors, because they're untrained or undertrained, are preaching heresy, false miracles, doctrines that don't exist, the prosperity gospel, those kinds of things. And so these people were asked a very simple question. What does a pastor need to be able to know, to do, and to be in order to be declared competent? In other words, knowledge, skills, and character. And they came up with 35 competencies. And those competencies reflect skills, knowledge, character. And to each of those, we attached an outcome. So we took those to the World Evangelical Alliance, And they agreed that that could become the first standard, global standard for non-formal ministry training. So when we issue a certificate to somebody who can successfully demonstrate those competencies, the logo of Reformer appears on the certificate and the logo of the World Evangelical Alliance, and it's signed by both. So for the first time in church history, we now have a global standard for those people who can't get a formal qualification.
Now, let's just backtrack a little. Pastors who maybe you wake up one day and you've been, and I say, I want to be a pastor. I'm feeling I've got the knowledge and I've got the calling. And what's the role of a pastor from your standpoint?
Just going back to what you said about the calling, there are many pastors who become pastors, sadly, not because of a calling, but because of a desire for financial gain. And that's become a real issue in the church, as you know. It's absolutely essential that a pastor has to have a calling from God. Otherwise, they're wasting their time. God calls certain people to put them into positions of leadership. And the pastor has a tremendous influence in the community. Often people will say, well, because my pastor says so, I believe it. So yes, a pastor is definitely a leader and performs a role in the community which is incredibly important.
Indeed, because pastors really, spiritual leadership, they're shepherds, counselors, community organizers, educators, that's where everybody literally runs to, men, women, children. Are we being fair to pastors?
Now we're introducing the issue of mental health, and it's really important that there's a balance in the pastor's life. There's some communities where if the pastor is at home, he's on duty. And so if people feel that they can just walk in and he has to help them or she has to help them. But there are cases where pastors, in order to pursue their studies, will leave their house and go and move somewhere else because then the community says, well, the pastor's not home, so it's fine, we won't bother him. But if he's at home, he's on duty. And in some countries, that can be a real issue for mental health. Pastors have to find a way by which they can balance their duties and their family life, of course.
Because indeed, I think they're all literally 24/7.
Often it is, and they sleep with their phones on. Sometimes they have two phones. It's amazing to see how they get by. I've been in Korea, for example, and in Korea, if you go out with the pastor for lunch, he's sitting there with his phone and he's talking to you, but all the time people are calling him, he's on duty. And he only gets 7 days leave a year, and he's expected then to go and pray for his congregation in those 7 days. So it can be very, very demanding, sometimes far too demanding, I think. We have to find a balance.
So let's get into the importance of continuous education and training. And here I'm looking at the need for ongoing theological education and leadership training for pastors. And I guess that's where you plug in.
Yes, but most of the professions in the world, once you registered, they will require you to do continuing professional development. You have to go to a conference or a seminar, or you have to do a course every year. But up until now, it's never been the case in theology. So if a pastor is qualified, does have a formal qualification, once they're in the pulpit, that's probably it. They hardly ever asked, well, you have to earn so many points this year to keep your registration. In fact, in most countries, registration has never been an issue, but it is beginning to be an issue because more and more governments are seeing the abuse that is taking place in many of the churches, and so they have to protect their citizens, which I agree with. So more and more countries are saying, unless you register or unless you have some sort of certificate, you will not be able to continue. And I want to talk a little bit about Rwanda because, as you know, in 2018, Rwanda made a law that said that all pastors have to have a bachelor's degree. Well, they immediately closed down 6,000 churches. Just closed them down. And since then, another 2,000. So the pastors were really worried that the church would suffer terribly, understandably. So we began to talk to what is known as the Rwandan Governance Board. That is the board that addresses theological and religious issues, reports directly to the president. We had a couple of meetings with them, and I'm happy to say that last Monday, in the third meeting, we were able to call together all the denominational leaders in Rwanda. We had prepared a statement alongside the Bishop of the Evangelical Alliance in Rwanda, and every single one of those 31 denominational leaders signed that document. And we took it to the Rwandan Governance Board, and they are satisfied. And so now, for the first time, Rwandan pastors are able to use the Reformer certificate as being sufficient for those pastors who are not bishops, who are not in charge. They still have to have a bachelor's degree. But the ones that are at the second level can now use a Reformer certificate to satisfy the requirements of their denomination. And that's a huge breakthrough for the church in Rwanda. They were so pleased with that decision, I can tell you, because they were desperately afraid that they would be closed down. And since I've come here, I've sensed that a similar thing is beginning to happen here. And it's likely to happen in other countries. And I think more and more people will hopefully say, well, if Rwanda has been able to solve the problem through Reformer, we need to do the same thing. So right now, as you know, last week, in fact, it was this week that one of the district officials here announced that churches in his district would only have 30 days to register their churches, otherwise they would be closed down. And I suspect that that may continue. So if Reformer can assist in that matter and help these churches to register because of our certificate, that would be a huge help to the church here.
And that speaks to then the kind of programs that have been lined up, their suitability, what options do they have, what kind of programs are the pastors then exposed to?
So we are,
workshops and so on.
yeah, so we are only working at the non-formal level. We don't work at the formal level. And we're not people find this hard to understand. We're not a Bible college or a seminary or a university. We just provide the standard. We don't mind how people get to the standard as long as they can successfully demonstrate those competencies. And I liken it to perhaps the story of a person who goes for a driver's license. The examiner in that situation doesn't ask the student, so how did you learn? Did your uncle teach you? Did you go to a driving school? Did your mother help you? All they're interested in is, can you drive this vehicle according to the standard that we have set? And it's exactly the same with Reformer. We don't mind how they get there, as long as they can successfully meet the standard. However, when we started to enroll groups of students around the world, we soon discovered that most of these groups do not have a formal qualification, do not have any attachment to a Bible college or a seminary or a curriculum. They have nothing because they're in rural communities. Sometimes the pastors only have a primary school qualification, but they're doing the best they can. So we wrote comprehensive notes for each of these competencies so that the facilitator of those students can have something to depend on. And then as soon as there are enough facilitators in a country, we come to the country and we train the facilitators, which is what we're doing this week here in Kenya. I think this is the 5th time we've been here, but we've been to many countries, and we absolutely determined to make sure that the standard is global, whether the person is in Kenya or Cuba or Kinshasa or you name it. We want that global standard to apply to them equally. Right now we have 2,620 groups in 87 countries with these competencies in 63 languages. So more and more groups are enrolling, like 2 or 3 every day.
Wow. Now, and when you said standards, there is a standard being set. There is the question of those who meet the standards, but the maintenance of the standard as ongoing, and what happens to those who drop below the standards, as it were, and how do you monitor to confirm?
Very good
adherence?
question. So, right here in Kenya, we have appointed Maggie, who is with us today. She is responsible as the national representative for Reformer in Kenya to visit these groups, to make sure she sees what's going on, to help them if they're struggling, to pray with them, to have a meal with them if necessary, and to promote the standards that we adhere to. So her task is incredibly important, and we're trying to appoint these national representatives in various countries.
The evil one is at work, and I can assure you, his standards are one to destroy. So, what about those who may be tempted to be quacks and purport to have that standards? I mean, we've seen it in education. I mean, even with the basic bachelors that Rwanda requires, and with all due respect to our political leaders, when we're told that to be a governor, you must have minimum a certain level of education, and suddenly someone attains some online degree in 2 weeks, and they're governors.
Yes, sadly, that is the case, and unfortunately, the sin that is in man will always try to cheat in some way whatsoever. However, the certificate that we issue to these people has a very secure code built into the certificate so that only that person can be attached to that certificate. So if somebody tries to forge the certificate or use the number or something like that, they'll soon be found out. That code at the bottom of the certificate also allows a person who wants to prove that this person does have a certificate, let's say for a job offer, to click on the code, and it will take them to a secure website where their name is recorded and only their name is recorded. So it's really, really difficult to forge that certificate.
Now let's get into appreciating the role of seminaries, theological institutions that provide that strong foundation, as it were, in biblical studies, ministry skills, and practical theology.
So if you have to add up all the students who are currently studying in theology in universities, accredited seminaries, and accredited Bible colleges, they only make up 5% of the need. And that 5% is shrinking very fast because thousands of churches are being planted every day. Every day we need about 1,000 new pastors. By 2050, we will need 9.7 million pastors. That's the estimate, 9.7 million. So that 5%, if the seminaries and Bible colleges can't provide more than that now, that 5% is soon going to become 4%, 3%, 2%. So there's no way that those institutions, much as we need them because we need professors, we need Bible teachers, we need qualified people. So I'm not deriding the seminaries. I was the president of a seminary. But the biggest need is growing in the non-formal sector. And so we have to find a solution there. And that's why Reformer exists.
Have you found a sense of for lack of better description, resistance to subscribe to a standard, that you have those that go off on a tangent? Or have you been welcomed openly every time, everywhere for Reform?
We've been very much welcomed because I think most governments are beginning to say the nonsense that's been going on in certain churches can't continue. We have to protect our citizens. We have to introduce some form of regulation which is going to protect the people that we are supposed to be in charge of. So, no, we don't really find resistance. We find a tremendous openness, a willingness to cooperate, and you can see from the number of groups that are enrolling every day. Some of those groups are huge. One group has 2,600 schools worldwide. So I think it's soon going to be the case where people will say, do you have the Reformer certificate as being the standard? And another thing that's interesting that goes along with that is that previously, maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was a tremendous sense of competition amongst theological institutions. These are my students, don't touch them, don't come into my territory, that kind of thing. But I think people are beginning to realize that unless we collaborate, we're never going to solve this problem. And over the last 2 years, particularly, there's been a much greater sense of collaboration.
Wonderful. Now, how do you build then emotional and spiritual resilience? Because it's not all lovey-dovey easy. In this world, we're told by Christ that we will have problems.
So we have in the 37 outcomes, the 37 competencies, character development, for example, things like humility, integrity, simplicity, the fruit of the Spirit, those kinds of things, which the student has to actually demonstrate, not just know about, but demonstrate. And we've tried in those 37 outcomes to cover all the aspects of what a pastor will need to know, to do, and to be. And that includes that resilience that you're talking about.
And maybe you could share some practical strategies that pastors could use to maintain their own well-being while supporting their congregations, because you're empowering pastors, and these pastors also then have, in a sense, they're shepherding a flock and their demands. So how do you encourage or support that?
So again, within the outcomes, we try to cover everything that a pastor needs. And if they are properly equipped and they're properly able to demonstrate those outcomes, I think they are well equipped to be able to deal with those situations. But again, we come back to mental health. And I think a pastor really needs to think deeply about how much time must I spend with my family? How much time must I spend with the church, my responsibilities? Yes, it's a full-time job, although there are many, as you know, that are bivocational. But they have to put a plan in place by which they can protect their health, protect the relationship with their wife and family. That's critically important. And their own moral nature. And sadly, as you know, every time you see a great megachurch leader fall because of some kind of misdemeanor with somebody in the congregation, that hurts the church amazingly, very badly. Not just their church, but the church globally, because the world looks at that and says, well, if that's what the pastors are doing, what's the difference between them and us? So the pastors have to have a sense of determination to look after those various areas of their life, especially the moral nature, because damaging that could damage the church very badly.
Indeed, and you're held to a higher standard when you're, a pastor.
Absolutely.
And all too often, you can actually lose your family as you're doing ministry.
Absolutely, and that's a very grave danger. Some people don't seem to worry about it, and that's very hurtful, I think, for the church, because the model of the family and the role of the pastor and his wife and children are critically important. The people look at them and say, well, we want to be like that. And if their life is in a mess or their marriage is struggling, that's a bad example for the congregation.
Indeed, indeed. And it'd be really unfortunate where you find in a family that those who they pastor turn out right, but their own families, they grow up and just say, Reuben was absent in our lives. If there's anything I don't want to do is be like him.
True.
And that would really be sad.
It would.
Technology. How do you utilize technology and the so-called modern tools? Is anything new? Should you be scared with all these stories of AI and others?
So one of the outcomes asks the pastors to demonstrate a competence of using technology effectively. Some pastors are afraid of technology, and some pastors, of course, live in communities where the network is not good and they struggle. But we're trying to persuade them that although there are really bad things on the internet, and some people are afraid and say, oh, the internet is devil's work or something like that. We're trying to show them that if you use technology positively, you can spread the gospel. We're living in a period of history which is amazingly gifted in terms of technology. Think about 30 years ago. Emails and things like that just didn't exist. Now we can send a message in a second. We can also send a message to a social media where millions of people are posting every day. YouTube, every second, the statistics are phenomenal. So why shouldn't we use the technology to promote the gospel? Not to promote ourselves. And we stress this. We don't want to see pastors taking photos of themselves all the times and, oh, look who I was with today, and look at my arm is around so-and-so, and, I visited this, I'm a famous person today. We don't want that. We want them to promote their ministry so that people will be drawn to the kingdom. And yes, we try to use technology where we can, but we're also very sensitive to the fact that some people live in areas where technology is not available to them in the same way. Having said that, the pace at which technology is working, I don't think we're too far away from a sense of everybody has internet. It's improving so fast in so many areas. Yes, it's still weak in some countries, but it isn't going to be long before everybody has strong internet. That's the way the world is working. So churches, pastors have to utilize that as a benefit.
We'll discover just the different generations that exist where pastors are and get to see how comfortable they are, how they're navigating, in a sense, as we're doing the Great Commission this time. The mountain, Drakensberg, Friesberg, is going to where Abraham is. We'll be back after this short break. Don't go away.
You, the listener, are the reason why we go on air. You, the friend of hope, are the reason why hope is alive. You have helped us take hope across the country and to the rest of the world. Through your giving, we have been on air for 18 years and witnessed many people coming to the Lord. Through your giving, we have expanded our reach to 3 new regions, namely Kisii, Nyeri, and Meru. Through your giving, we have expanded our reach to an international audience through DSTV and GoTV platforms. Thank you for your sacrifice and generosity toward this great initiative. As we continue spreading hope to the other unreached regions in Kenya, you are invited to be part of the Friends of Hope through a contribution of any amount via M-Pesa Paybill 933933, account name FOH. Friends of Hope, keeping hope alive. God bless you.
The East Africa Women of Excellence Awards Gala Dinner is here. This award celebrates the brilliance, resilience, and outstanding achievement of remarkable trailblazing women who have shattered glass ceilings in their various spheres of influence and fields. Join us for the awards ceremony happening on Friday, the 14th of June 2024 from 6 p.m. at Safari Park Hotel, Nairobi. Our chief guest is Honorable Aisha Jumwa, Cabinet Secretary at the Ministry of Gender, Culture, the Arts and Heritage. To attend, get a corporate table at 60,000 Kenya shillings and for individual at 8,000 Kenya shillings. Make your payments via paybill number 933-933, account name WOE. For partnership and sponsorship, call Eunice on 0719-863-336 or email customerexperience@hopefm.org. This event will be live on Hope TV, the East African Women of Excellence Awards, recognizing East African women of impact.
There's this incredible story in John 5 that tells of Jesus healing a man who was paralyzed for 38 years at a place called the Pool of Bethesda. Now, the word Bethesda literally means house of grace, and yet there was little grace to be found there because crippled people were actually not allowed inside the temple, so they went to the pool with hopes of a supernatural healing of angels stirring up the water. Here's the point. Jesus said his body was a temple, and he said the temple would be destroyed but raised 3 days later. The word Shekinah or glory literally means dwelling, and yet this crippled man was not allowed inside the dwelling of the glory of God, was actually excommunicated, wasn't given grace, and that's the very person that Jesus gave the healing to. And I want to tell you in the same way that if you've been ostracized, marginalized, pushed to the fringes, if you've been disenfranchised and disenchanted, you're the very person that God gives grace, healing to, the very person that he dwells among.
Hope TV presents News on the Go every day at 4 p.m. for all the breaking news and news making headlines. Hope TV, look and leave.
We're getting into a very interesting phase. Just before the break, we're discussing, the whole aspects of impact, reformer, training, outcomes. And just to appreciate Adrian Mudibo says we need to pray more indeed. Without prayer, you're going nowhere. Maggie says, insights here, great insights on the solution to the pastor's training. Discipline, including the facilitators that you have. And even outcomes, standards. What does Reformer say in terms of where does one draw the line through prosperity, through possession, through, vis-a-vis the pastoral training and outcomes? We're curious.
There's so many things that pastors who are drawn to things like the prosperity gospel, power, influence, that need to be addressed, and we do address them in the outcomes. We have to move pastors away from this concept of living lives where they have to wear a white suit, pointy shoes, they have to have a gold throne on the stage, and they have to have a jet and arrive in a limousine with outriders, as one of the YouTube videos shows. Jesus lived a very humble, simple life. No resources, he hardly had any money. His clothes were simple. He said, foxes have holes, but the Son of Man has no place to rest his head. His life should be the model for pastors, should be. We always used to have that expression, what would Jesus do? Well, if you look at what Jesus did and you look at the lives of some of the pastors, especially in Africa, they are miles apart. And that has to change. That has to change because it's damaging the church.
And, your facilitators, how many does Kenya have in terms of the centers?
580.
And in terms of where Reformer has presence, where do we stand?
In countries?
Yes.
We have 87 countries. At the moment, and growing. So yesterday, for example, for the first time, we had an enrollment from Mongolia.
Wow.
But we are getting them from all over the world, and 2 or 3 every day. So God is really using Reformer to help pastors. And it's helpful to know that the program is free of charge. So we don't charge for this, and we don't charge to come to Kenya or any other country and train the facilitators. We have to raise that finance. The only cost to a student is $5 for the certificate at the end, but that's more to show them that they need to appreciate something that they've earned rather than get it free. If they get it free, they tend to disregard it.
That's right, yeah, they don't attach any sense of
But the
pride.
program itself and everything we supply and all the research we do, the materials we give them, it's all free of charge. We have to raise that finance, but we're determined to do that because the crisis in the church that has been created by pastors who are untrained or undertrained is incredible. We just have to look around at the abuse, things that people are doing, making their congregation swallow snakes or spraying poison in their face and ridiculous things like that, sexual misdemeanors. It's a terrible catalogue of evil. And unless we address that now, the church is just going to go one way.
Some positive testimonies, I believe, were shared, even just the recent training. Could you
Yes, last
share
night,
some of that? Yeah.
we're currently working with about 50 facilitators here in Kenya at this training. And last night we had a time of sharing testimonies of people who have used the material and have seen the change that that has made. One pastor, for example, said that for the first time in his life, he washed the dishes and cleaned in his house, things that he didn't even know he could do, because it has made a difference in his life to see what the biblical position is of servant leadership, for example. Others spoke about the way in which the church, which had focus in one area, has now returned to a more biblical view. And that's the kind of positive testimony that we're looking for. We want impact.
Impact, yes, indeed. Powerful. And especially where the man says he had to wash dishes. I mean, I can appreciate Jesus washed his disciples' feet.
Exactly, servant leadership. That's what it's all about. One of the outcomes is about servant leadership.
Leadership, indeed. Let's talk about balancing leadership responsibilities with personal well-being. And here I'm looking at tips that you may have or within your training or certification in terms of standards for pastors to balance their demanding roles with personal and family life, discussing the importance of setting boundaries, as it were, and self-care practices.
One tip might be turn off your cell phone while you're having a meal with your family, and make sure that you have a meal with your family, not I eat now, my wife eats in an hour's time, I have to run off to this meeting, my children have to be taken to something. Let's focus on solidifying a strong family relationship where we eat together, where there's no interruptions from social media, we turn off the TV if necessary, we set boundaries, we have a time every day for the pastor, any father really, to lead his family in some form of worship, reading the scriptures together, praying together as a family. Those are priorities. They should be priorities for the pastor, because if he doesn't do that, slowly but surely his family is going to slip away, and we can't have that. So yes, boundaries. And it's the pastor's responsibility, perhaps even in consultation with his family, to draw up a sort of daily routine where he can roughly, I know there are exceptions to that, but roughly keep to that so that he maintains that relationship.
Indeed, because the evil one, if you want to destroy a nation, a people, a community, it's the family.
Absolutely.
That you scatter,
yes,
so to speak. And financial stewardship, we're getting to very interesting space
critically
now.
important, because in many of these churches, the pastor, if it's a small church, doesn't have a secretary, doesn't have a financial person to help him. He is the only person employed by the church, or she, and looking after the administration and the finances of the church becomes his responsibility, another thing that he has to do. And sadly, in situations like that, there's tremendous temptation to say, oh, I took the offering this week, and some of it is mine, and some of it is for this, but most of it is for me. And so we have to make sure that we train these pastors to be able to administrate the church ethically and with integrity. And I'm sure we want to talk about integrity as well.
Indeed, integrity, because that space is one where others would feel uncomfortable discussing integrity, financial matters when their pastors are involved, because you feel like that's a no-go zone.
Sadly, across Africa, we have found several pastors who have a terrible lack of integrity. Whether it's because they came into the pastorate without a calling, I'm not too sure. But they cheat. And it's very sad to see it. And we've encountered it, sadly. And I'll share a couple of examples.
Yeah, please do.
So a few years ago, we were here. We did a large training with facilitators. There was one pastor who had registered his church, registered his group. He'd come to the training. He did the training. And then afterwards, Maggie, our national representative, found out that he didn't have a church and he didn't have a group. He just came for the 3 days holiday. On another occasion, one of the pastors who had done the training, who did have a group, who was training his people, got sick. He got sick. He was admitted to hospital. He phoned Maggie and he said, Reuben has authorized you to pay my hospital bills,
Oh,
which of course I hadn't done. So
okay,
there are these sad cases. Recently, we had a case where a pastor enrolled 11 students, supposedly went through the program, we got assessment sheets, which we demand. We issued the certificates. Then one of the students phoned us. Can I please have a transcript? Now, we don't issue transcripts because these are competencies we're dealing with here, not subjects. So we got a bit suspicious and we started to do investigation, and we found out that he had never had one session with those students. He never taught them anything. At all. This program is supposed to last more or less 12 months or more. He had never trained them in anything, and in fact, he got them to sign their own assessment sheets. So they received certificates of competence, putting them into positions of leadership and the pastorate in their churches when they had no training whatsoever. And I mean, I was devastated. It's just a total lack of integrity. And that kind of thing, obviously we withdrew the certificates at that point. That kind of thing has urged us to include at least an hour session in every training just on the topic of integrity, because it's critically important. We have to be the same people in public as we are in private. And it's even more so the case for pastors, because people are looking at them and watching how they behave and saying, well, if Christianity is like that and he shows a lack of integrity, I'm not interested in Christianity. So pastors need to behave as all Christians should, with absolute integrity.
Indeed, I mean, there are instances, with all due respect, where some pastors are held as demigods.
Yes.
His word, our word, is just because I've had. And you've got all these, I'll ask for forgiveness after this, sycophants around the pastors, who then create a ring around and buffer. And you, the pastor, may not even be aware of, but those who you have around as your leadership team are the ones who are soiling the name and taking advantage.
It's very sad. It's damaging the church very badly. And we have to intervene now, because if we don't, we're on a slippery slope, really. We have to intervene now.
Would you advocate for administrative action, quote unquote, like we have in the police? Someone has a misdemeanor in one set and then transferred to another location to go and take his mischief there? Or do you then recommend and call in the cops and say this is criminal in nature when they fall?
We follow the biblical position as far as discipline is concerned. So, as you know, in Matthew 18, it describes what the process should be. We first need to talk to the person. Then we need to call others to join us, witnesses. And if that person does not respond, according to the biblical position, they should be excommunicated from the church. Why should a pastor not be held accountable for his misdemeanors simply because he has a pastor, or because he has a people around him who are protecting him? I have no sympathy for pastors who commit misdemeanors. They need to be disciplined.
How do you nurture a God-fearing society as a pastor?
The pastor plays a critical role in the community. The example that he sets for his church very often filters down into the community, and the words that he uses from the pulpit filter down into the community. I don't think pastors realize how strong their influence is. And when we train pastors to be effective in their ministry, we're actually saying, you're going to be effective in your community, and your community has to be impacted. If the pastor is saying certain things and the community is not being impacted, then there's a problem.
Now, if we could look big bird's eye view, reformer, I imagine we've got sub-themes, just an overview of the different outcomes. How are they categorized? What can we expect? I mean, there's a whole roll of, you said what, outcomes 37, 30,
37 outcomes. So,
yeah, just give me a big picture view and how then that is packaged and what can we
so,
expect?
so think of the original question. What does a pastor need to be able to know, to do, and to be? One, we start with a group of 11 outcomes on character. And we start with the character ones first because the facilitator, who becomes the assessor at the end of the program, has to watch that student as the character is formed over the duration of time. You can't teach humility in 30 minutes and then say, oh, I'm going to assess you now. Are you humble? You have to watch that person over a period of maybe 12 months. Watch them in their community, watch them in their church, watch them in the classroom, and then be able to say, okay, this person has successfully demonstrated. So the first group of 11 focus on this character formation, character development. Obviously, we then turn to the scriptures. So the next set of 11 are focused on knowing the word, and there we're really looking intensely at the content. We also have a section on skills. So a pastor must be able to preach, must be able to evangelize, must be able to teach a Bible study. And then finally, looking after the flock, things like counseling, things like what is the role of children in the church, something that's been ignored for so many years. We look at something that very few people ever look at, and that is absentee fathers. Why in some houses is the person there, but he's not there? He doesn't spend any quality time with his children. So by breaking them up into these 4 sections, we believe we've covered those 3 basic questions: knowledge, skills, attitudes and values, character development.
And at the end of it all, leading by example, the trainers, the pastors, if I have got the calling and I have ticked the box, is there a minimum criteria in terms of the flock that someone comes in and says, I'm a pastor of 1?
That would be a very strange thing. Most flocks of sheep are greater than 1. There's no minimum and maximum requirement. So when we train pastors, for example, in groups, we don't say to them there must be at least 5 in your group, there must be 10 in your group. But at the same time, we don't want the facilitators' groups to be too big. We're not talking here about a number of people in the church, but the facilitators' groups shouldn't be more than about 15, because it makes assessment very difficult. If you're watching a student, if you're listening to the way they speak in class, watching their group activities, setting them tasks week after week, then it becomes extremely difficult to do effectively if you're taking too large a group. So 10, 15 would be about the right number. As far as congregations are concerned, if the statistics are true, there are 50,000 new baptized believers every day in the world. 50,000. So if you were to take 50 of those and start a new church, you would need 1,000 pastors a day. So probably when you start a church, you might only have a handful. But then you have to develop that. My son is a missionary in Ecuador, and he's just planted a church in his own house in a remote village called Saraguro. And that number is very small to start with. But I have no doubt that as the truth of the gospel is proclaimed, doesn't matter how big it was when it started, that church will begin to grow and it will begin to seep into the community. It'll make a difference. We don't, I think, realize the power of the gospel. It is the power of the gospel unto salvation. We have to preach the gospel, and when we start small, it doesn't matter. I don't think God is so worried about, numbers. Whereas some of these mega churches, they have 40, 50,000 people attending on a Sunday. Well, so what?
Paint for me a picture of Reformer in 5 years, 10 years. Where do you see Reformer?
I think tens of thousands of groups will enroll, because more and more nations will realize that we need a global standard for these untrained pastors. We need something that will say, if he's got that or she's got that, that is sufficient. I'll just take one step back. If you want to become a doctor or an engineer or an accountant, you have to reach a certain standard and you have to register with somebody, national health or whatever it's called in that country. And you have to maintain your registration by doing certain things every year. But the church has always just said, it doesn't matter, you can just become a pastor. You don't have to register with anybody, you don't have to qualify. That's changing. We've seen it in Kenya, it's changing. Governments are starting to say, sorry, you have to register, you have to reach some sort of standard. And I think the more countries that take that stance, the more people will enroll with Reformer. Before we went to Rwanda, 6 weeks ago, we had 35 groups enrolled there. The moment we announced that we were coming to Rwanda, and the moment we got the denominational leaders to sign that document, we now have 72 groups enrolled in Rwanda. And it'll go like this. And I suspect the same thing will happen here and in other countries. 5 years from now, who knows? 10,000 groups? We don't know. But one thing I do know is that the equipping that those groups are receiving as a result of being asked to successfully demonstrate the competencies is definitely affecting the church positively. It's affecting the country positively because governments then can say, okay, we don't have to worry so much about what these pastors are doing.
Does Africa is a youthful, relatively young population-wise in terms of the demographics? There are those who argue and say that Africa is where rejuvenation of the gospel is.
Definitely.
And if so, is it not time then for Africa to reach out to the world with those standards? And I'm very glad that you're doing it at Reformer.
There's no question about it. So we used to talk about the West to the rest, meaning missions came from the West and it was taken to the rest, like Africa. Now we're talking about the rest to the West. Africa is beginning to send missionaries to America. Think about that. Churches in the UK are now becoming pubs, are becoming houses. They're converting them into houses. The church in many parts of the world is dying. The mainland churches especially. They've suffered hugely. The church in Europe is tiny. And some of the biggest churches in Europe are being pastored by Africans. So, yes, definitely, Africa has a major role to play. And by 2050, Africa is going to be way ahead in terms of numbers of believers. So we have to respond accordingly.
And in terms of just the profile of the trainers, and have you seen a shift, a trend in terms of the demographic as we wind up?
I think in Africa, most of the countries that we've enrolled are here on this continent. In Hispanic countries, which is the next big target, it's been slow, but it's improving. So we are currently registering a non-profit in Guatemala for Latin America. We have one in Germany for Europe. We have one in South Africa for Africa. We have one in the Philippines for Asia. I think that continents that started slowly will expand as time goes by and they see what's happening in the rest of the world. I have every confidence.
What a discussion, what insights. I'm so glad that we made Reformer. I'm reformed. Ruben.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
And look forward to hosting you again and just getting to appreciate the place you're playing. And indeed, pastors need empowering. And there's a place that Reformer is playing to that effect. Asante sana.
Thank you.
That has been The Leader, courtesy of Catalyst and the Evangelical Alliance of Kenya. Tell a friend to tune in next time. We thank you for the privilege of your time. Stay well, stay blessed.